The War of 1812 is a little more than a footnote if you pick up a U.S. history book, but its impact not only on America itself, but Canada, the banking system, future wars, the economy, manufacturing, and a collection of other things is still impacting us today, although it is not talked about very often. Let me give you a quick summary of the war itself, and then I will get into the impacts that were multifaceted that we still see today. The main cause of the war was that the British and the French were seizing United States ships. The British were doing it more at a hostile rate. They were also forcing some of the sailors on U.S. ships to become members of the Royal Navy. This was really hurting U.S. shipping. Previously, you had the Embargo Acts that were implemented by the Jefferson administration. It basically caused this greater conflict. But since the United States economy was struggling because the main way to distribute goods, import and export, was shipping, the ships were taken over by the British. And as a result, Madison had Congress declare war. The vote in the Senate was the closest in U.S. history, 19-13, that led to this conflict taking place. The United States knew that they could not face the British. At this time, they didn't have a standing navy, and their administration was very poor in terms of the army. A lot of their army were just militiamen. So they decided their best bet was to invade Canada, which was a part of Britain at that time. They figured it would be easy because of the population advantage. During that time, the United States had about 7 million people. In Canada, you had maybe 500,000. And a lot of those were recent American immigrants. And some of them were French residents who didn't really care. So they launched an invasion of Canada in 1812. But they had incompetent leaders and untrained soldiers. The results were catastrophic. And then you had the Treaty of Ghent, which was signed in modern-day Belgium. If you look at the numbers, the war lasted 34 months. Basically, it ended in a draw. Now, the interesting part about it is that although the British had 700 ships and the United States only had 17, the one-on-one battles tended to favor the United States. And that's because they had more maneuverable ships that were resistant to enemy fire. On the one-on-one battles, they tended to win. But because of the sheer advantage of the British, it was basically a draw. And of course, you had the burning of Washington because of the bad maladministration of the army during that time. They burnt the White House, they burnt the Treasury building, and all these other buildings. That's why we now have the modern White House, the different buildings, because the previous buildings were burnt down. And of course, we have the national anthem because of the bombing of Fort McHenry. You can look into the story, I'm not going to get into it here, but our national anthem is one of the impacts of the War of 1812 in the American flag. They had the flag that was stitched and placed upon Fort McHenry, two patriotic symbols. But one of the effects is Canada. Canada is its own sovereign country now. If the United States would have won the war and controlled Canada, who knows? Canada might be part of the United States today. Who knows what would have happened with that, but that's one of the effects. Another effect is that a lot of the American Indians fought with the British because they felt that their land was being taken from them, because they were getting screwed over in the treaties, especially Tecumseh. But Tecumseh got killed, and he was kind of seen as a folk hero for a lot of the Native Americans. His death was emblematic of a greater problem, which was that the Native Americans got slaughtered in the war, virtually. And after the war, they lost a lot more of their land. That was sort of the end of the Native American. They had 10,000 losses estimated in the war. The United States, after that, decided to have a standing navy and a better administrated army. So that is two results of the war that we still feel today that are not really talked about very often. Another thing is that when you had the embargo acts during the Jefferson and Madison administrations and the war itself, it encouraged manufacturing and trade in America. You also had technological advances like the spinning jenny, the steam engine, the mining machinery, and that really increased American manufacturing. These are the numbers I found. In 1805, American cotton mills operated 4,500 spindles. In 1805, they operated 130,000. The value of factory-made wools went from $4 million in 1810 to $19 million in 1815. We must now place the manufacturer by the side of the agriculturalist. That's what Jefferson said. The banking system. The embargo and policies preceding the war and the government expenditures during the conflict stimulated internal trade and manufactures, leading to an increase in the number and size of banks in the United States. In 1800, the nation had 29 banks. In 1816, there were 246. After Congress refused to recharter the first bank in 1811 and failed to provide an adequate national currency, large numbers of state banks formed to fill the vacuum. The state banks issued notes, leading to currency inflation. In addition, between March 1812 and March 1815, Congress authorized the Treasury to borrow $80 million to pay for the war. So basically, to make a long story short, Madison opposed a national bank before the war. So did Henry Clay and John Calhoun, who were very powerful members of Congress and the Senate. After the war, because of the debt and because of the confusion in currency, they rechartered the Second Bank of the United States. If you look at these large conflicts, like the Revolution, as I talked about in my previous video, the bankers always have a footprint in these conflicts. Now, there's a hypothesis that this war was used to start a national bank, which has merit, but I've not seen any documented evidence of this. But it definitely was a factor. So the second bank was chartered of the United States. American manufacturing grew. The Native Americans were finally virtually defeated off the land. Canada was kept sovereign, so they now are their own country. The United States improved its army, had a standing navy, and they rebuilt the White House and all these other institutions. And also, let me not forget the national anthem, the American flag. It's crazy to think all of these things culminate in what we see today. But yet this war is not talked about very often. Not necessarily the campaigns. I did a little research into the campaigns, some of the battles, and other than the Battle of New Orleans and a few naval battles, there's not many highlights of the conflict. The British were more focused on the Napoleonic Wars. They were in a battle with France. This was sort of a footnote in British history.